Alina Moore had no illusions about the circles her husband moved in. She was a tenured professor, well-respected in academic spaces, but she had never grown comfortable in the orbit of polished exclusivity and silent codes that came with Jordan's world. That morning, as sunlight filtered into their kitchen and glinted off the golden embossing of an ivory envelope, she felt a tension in her chest she couldn't name. It wasn't fear. Alina wasn't the kind of woman who feared a room. But she had learned over time how certain spaces, wrapped in wealth and layered with unspoken rules, could shrink a person's presence without ever raising their voice. The envelope was an invitation to the 6th birthday party of Madison Langford, daughter of Jordan's business partners, Cynthia and Richard. Vivre Blanc, the city's most exclusive restaurant, would host it. Jordan had mentioned it in passing, something she hadn't thought twice about at the time. They asked if we'd come. I said yes for both of us, he'd said between bites of his usual market greens. Just a formality, he'd added with a wink. But formality in these circles wasn't the same as in hers. Here, formality was a performance. And though she loathed the idea of blending in just to make others comfortable, she'd decided she would go. Not to impress, not to perform, but to be present. To take up space, unapologetically. She dressed with quiet precision that afternoon. No designer logos, no statement accessories, just a simple white slip dress that caressed her figure like second skin. Her natural coils pulled back into a sleek low bun. Her elegance wasn't for display, it was a declaration. At 3:00 p.m., the Uber pulled up to Vivre Blanc, its mirrored facade shimmering in the midday light like a monument to modern privilege. A valet opened her door with the instinctive politeness that came with his job, but his eyes paused on her for a fraction too long, just long enough to register something unsaid. She stepped out anyway, spine straight, expression neutral. Inside, the restaurant lived up to its myth. Marble floors that reflected light like water, chandeliers that sparkled with curated opulence, and a scent in the air that whispered truffle oil and chilled power. At the hostess stand, a woman named Amber greeted her with a tight smile and perfectly lacquered posture. Alina, steady and warm, gave her name and mentioned the reservation. She even specified the table, number 3, by the garden window, confirmed by her husband. Amber's smile didn't falter, but her eyes narrowed the tiniest bit. A few minutes later, she returned with a manager. They couldn't find her name. The table, she was told, had been given to someone else. "A regular guest," they said. "It's just a mix-up," they assured. But Alina knew better. Mix-ups had patterns, and this one had a familiar shape. Alina stood to the side of the hostess podium, alone but not unseen. Around her, the restaurant pulsed with soft jazz and murmured conversations, but no one looked her way. Not directly. They didn't need to. The absence of acknowledgement was its own kind of presence. She noticed the patterns, how the white guests were welcomed with soft nods and seamless seating, how a woman in red Louboutins didn't even have to give her name before being ushered to a private lounge. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Still, no table. Still, no correction. Then she saw it. A tall blonde woman in an emerald silk dress, entering like she owned the air around her. Veronica Langley. Of course. The hostess straightened her back, voice suddenly warmer, more practiced. "Miss Langley, welcome. Table 3 is ready for you." Alina turned, her voice steady but her jaw tight. "That table was reserved for me," she said. Amber barely blinked. There must have been a mix-up. Miss Langley is a regular. The manager, a man in his 40s with slicked back hair and a navy suit tailored for intimidation, stepped in. Gareth Simmons. His apology came with the smoothness of someone who had done this before. "We can seat you near the kitchen," he offered, as if that were a kindness. Alina felt something shift deep inside her. Not rage, not yet, but something firm, cold. She had spent her life building a reputation of excellence, yet here, in a space her husband helped finance, she was just another name they could choose not to see. The suggestion stung, but she didn't let it show. Being offered a seat near the kitchen wasn't just about location, it was about hierarchy. Gareth's tone was casual, like this was just an unfortunate oversight, not a clear dismissal. Alina's voice remained calm, but her eyes locked onto his with the weight of someone who'd learned long ago how to stand still when the ground moved under her. "You're offering me the kitchen while someone else takes my reservation?" she asked, her words measured but pointed. Gareth shrugged. Sometimes mix-ups happen. But it wasn't a mix-up. It was a message. She looked around, scanning the room for Jordan, but he hadn't arrived yet. There was no one to intervene. She was alone. At least, that's what they thought. And just as Gareth's hand motioned subtly toward security, preparing to have her escorted out under the guise of resolving the issue, the air shifted. A low hum, almost imperceptible, rolled in from the front of the restaurant. Heads turned, the doors glided open, and every conversation paused. The man stepping inside didn't need an introduction. Jordan Moore didn't command attention. He drew it in with gravity. Clad in a charcoal suit so perfectly tailored it seemed sculpted, he walked with purpose, not spectacle. And when his eyes found Alina, still standing, still waiting, his expression darkened in a way that no one in that room would ever forget. Jordan didn't speak right away. He moved through the dining room with a stillness that made people lean back, unsure whether to watch or pretend not to. His presence didn't scream. It whispered power in a way that made you listen harder. He stopped in front of Alina, his eyes scanning her expression before turning toward the hostess stand. "You been standing here this whole time?" he asked, voice low but lined with steel. Alina didn't answer. She didn't need to. The truth had already soaked into the silence. Jordan looked toward Gareth, now visibly stiff behind the podium. "You gave away the table my wife reserved?" The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. Everyone nearby heard them like a judgment being handed down. Gareth's reply was a stammered attempt at diplomacy. "We didn't realize this guest was your wife, Mr. Moore." And there it was, the confession, the coded honesty behind every corporate excuse. This guest, the one who didn't fit the mold, the one who wasn't supposed to matter until someone powerful arrived to say she did. Jordan's posture didn't shift, but the room around him did, like a curtain being drawn back. "Let me get this straight," he said slowly, voice sharp and smooth like glass. "You gave away the table my wife reserved to a guest who walked in without one, because you assumed my wife didn't belong here." Gareth opened his mouth, but only silence came out. Alina stood still, her hands at her sides, every muscle in her body taut, not with fear, but with memory. This wasn't her first time being mistaken for someone who didn't belong, but it might be the last time someone made that mistake without consequence. Jordan turned to the crowd, his voice still calm, but now unmistakably louder. "You thought she didn't belong because she wasn't dripping in logos or European arrogance," he said. "You buried her name under your bias." A ripple moved through the diners, some in disbelief, some in discomfort. Veronica Langley shifted in her chair, her smirk faltering just enough to reveal the tension underneath. But Jordan wasn't finished. "You don't need to know someone's title or who they're married to in order to treat them with basic respect." His words didn't rise, but they echoed louder than any outburst ever could. In that moment, Alina wasn't just his wife. She was the mirror being held up to the entire room. The weight of Jordan's words didn't just land. They sank into the marble floors and crept up the legs of every polished chair. No one moved. Even the pianist had reduced his playing to a hesitant murmur, as if afraid his notes might drown out the truth being spoken aloud. Gareth tried again, clearly scrambling. "It was simply a miscommunication, Mr. Moore. We had a last-minute request from a valued guest." Jordan didn't let him finish. "Which guest?" he asked, his tone colder now, knowing full well who it was. "Miss Langley," Gareth admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Alina spoke then, her voice soft but sharp. "The same woman who spent the year sitting on diversity panels and still looked at me like I was the staff." Jordan gave the slightest twitch of his mouth, more disbelief than amusement, but never looked away from Gareth. "You gave my wife's table to someone who walked in late, based solely on appearance," he said, and then offered her a seat by the kitchen like she should be grateful for the downgrade. Silence coated the room again, this time heavier, stickier, as if everyone had become painfully aware of how thin the veil of politeness really was when pressed against privilege. It wasn't the table. That had become clear now. It was the assumption. The hierarchy wrapped in white linen and folded menus that didn't list prices because dignity, apparently, had a cost. And in this place, Alina had been deemed short on currency. Jordan turned to the crowd, his voice low but deliberate. "This is why I stayed silent," he said. "To see how this place operated when no one thought I was watching. Today, I watched you fail." He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and held it up. On the screen, the reservation confirmation. Time-stamped, verified, undeniable. You didn't just ignore a name, he said. You tried to erase it. Veronica, now visibly shrinking at table 3, attempted to play it cool. Let's not get dramatic, she said with a hollow laugh, trying to lighten the moment. I'm sure we can all be adults about this. But no one laughed with her. Not this time. Jordan looked at her briefly, then back to Gareth. You've embarrassed my wife. You've embarrassed this brand. And you've revealed more about this place in 20 minutes than any audit ever could. Then he turned to Alina and offered his hand, not out of chivalry, but defiance. A silent reclamation of what should never have been taken. Alina took his hand with quiet resolve, not because she needed to be saved, but because solidarity sometimes speaks louder than fury. Together, they walked toward table 3, passing rows of hushed conversations and frozen forks halfway to mouths. Veronica Langley remained seated, her drink in hand, legs elegantly crossed like she hadn't just been unmasked in front of a room full of people who once admired her. Jordan stopped at the table, gaze calm but steady. Ms. Langley, he said, tone almost pleasant. I believe you're in the wrong seat. Veronica didn't flinch. She raised her chin and offered a small smile, her voice syrupy. Oh, I didn't realize it was such a big deal. I assumed it was first come, first served. She sipped from her flute as if the wine might wash away her discomfort, but Alina didn't let it slide. To you, it's never about principle, she said, her voice clipped and cold. It's about convenience wrapped in entitlement. The words weren't shouted. They were carved, clean and undeniable. Around them, heads turned. A couple at the bar whispered. One man dropped his napkin. Veronica's smirk wavered, but she stood slowly, brushing the front of her dress like she was shaking off the moment. She tried to make it look graceful, but the shift in the room was seismic. No one was buying the performance anymore. Jordan held out the chair for Alina, who sat down with the kind of dignity that couldn't be denied. It wasn't about making a scene. It was about restoring a truth. Gareth, still lingering near the hostess stand, tried to reinsert himself into the narrative. Mr. Moore, he said, inching forward like a man trying to salvage a sinking ship. Perhaps we can move Dr. Moore to another section to de-escalate things. Jordan turned to him slowly, disbelief flickering in his expression. You want to move my wife because your other guests are uncomfortable, with her sitting at her own reserved table? Gareth stammered something about courtesy, but his voice cracked under the weight of his own cowardice. Alina stood again, slower this time, measured. Her words came like a blade wrapped in velvet. Let me be clear, she said. You denied my reservation. You handed my seat to someone else. You watched as I was humiliated. And now you want to remove me? Her eyes flicked to the security guards that Gareth had quietly summoned. You want them to drag me out too? The guards shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure what side of the story they were walking into. One of them looked at Alina, then down at the floor. He wouldn't meet her gaze. Jordan stepped forward then, positioning himself between Alina and the men in suits. He didn't raise his voice, but the air around him seemed to pull tight, like a rope about to snap. Now you understand, he said, eyes locked on Gareth. From this moment, you and I are no longer speaking as manager and investor. We're speaking as two men on opposite sides of a lawsuit. The word hung in the air like a slow-moving thunderclap. Someone gasped. Another guest dropped their fork. Even the sound system seemed to falter, as if the restaurant itself understood something irreversible had just occurred. Gareth blanched, mouth opening and closing like he wanted to retreat into the shadows. This isn't necessary, he mumbled, voice suddenly smaller than it had ever been. It became necessary, Jordan cut in. The moment you decided her presence was conditional. The whole room was listening now, not just out of curiosity, but because something real was happening, and no one wanted to look away from it. This wasn't just a dinner. This was a reckoning. Alina sat down again, not because she was tired, but because it was her seat. This time she didn't smile. She didn't even look at Gareth. She was done performing respect for people who had offered none in return. Jordan placed a hand gently on her shoulder, not as a gesture of comfort, but alignment. Partnership. Gareth tried to speak again, his mouth fumbling over a half apology, but Jordan cut him off with a finality that made it clear there would be no redemption arc. You have 1 hour, he said. We're calling an emergency board meeting. And don't bother touching the reservation logs. We already have the originals. His voice was crisp, exact. And as he sat down next to Alina, the room held its breath. There was no applause. No applause was needed. Just a collective understanding that something had shifted, and it wouldn't be shifting back. Around them, crystal glasses still clinked, but every conversation felt forced, every movement laced with caution. What had once been polished performance was now a fragile silence, and at its center sat a woman who had refused to be moved. Veronica Langley had relocated to another table 2 spots away, but her presence lingered like perfume after someone leaves the room. Unwanted, overbearing, impossible to ignore. She wasn't talking now, she wasn't smirking. She sat perfectly still, gaze averted, fingers wrapped tight around the stem of her glass as if clinging to the last remnants of composure. Alina, meanwhile, surveyed the room like someone who'd just regained her vision. Not a single face looked her in the eye for too long. Even the confident ones, the hedge funders, the socialites, the brunch committee organizers, kept their glances brief. This wasn't the power Alina had ever wanted, but it was the one she'd claimed. Not through shouting, not through spectacle, but through presence. Gareth eventually reappeared, not alone this time. 2 security guards flanked him, their tailored suits a shallow disguise for discomfort. He approached table 3 with careful steps, rehearsed concern in his voice. "Dr. Moore," he began, "we've received another guest request to de-escalate the room. Perhaps relocating you might—" "Let me stop you there," Jordan said, not looking up from his glass of water. "Are you seriously suggesting we move because someone else is uncomfortable with her being seated at her own table?" Gareth blinked, as if surprised that the logic didn't land. "It's merely a courtesy, sir." He tried again, but the words sounded hollow, even to himself. And that's when something invisible cracked. Not just in the room, but in Alina. She stood again, but not in protest. In clarity. Her hands rested on the edge of the table, her voice lower now, yet sharp enough to slice through the linen-wrapped elegance around them. "Let me see if I understand," she said. "You denied my reservation. You gave away my seat. You watched as I was humiliated in front of your guests. And now your solution is to remove me to keep the peace?" The guards didn't move. They couldn't. One of them shifted uncomfortably, looking anywhere but at her. "Because I promise you," she continued, her tone even, lethal, "I've survived worse things than this velvet-lined circus of curated civility." She didn't need to raise her voice. The room was already listening. Her words weren't for Gareth anymore. They were for everyone still pretending not to be watching. And in that moment, her voice became the loudest sound in the building. Jordan stepped beside her, no longer just a witness, but a wall. "Now you understand," he said, eyes locked on Gareth, who looked like he wanted to sink into the marble beneath his feet. "This isn't a discussion. This is documentation. From this moment, we're no longer discussing reputations. We're discussing accountability." And just like that, the stakes shifted. This wasn't about restoring comfort anymore. It was about defining consequences. The word lawsuit had already been said, but now the idea of legal fallout wasn't abstract. It was visible. Gareth's face paled further as Jordan continued. "Your bias has become policy, and that's not just morally wrong. It's professionally lethal." The silence in the room tightened. Even Veronica sat completely still now, her posture ridged, glass untouched. It wasn't just a social error. It was institutional negligence. Jordan leaned down and spoke just loud enough for Gareth to hear. "And the worst part? You didn't even think twice. That's what makes it systemic." Alina didn't need to say anything more. Her presence was the final word. She sat down again, not as someone being accommodated, but as someone reclaiming what should never have been challenged. Jordan took the seat beside her. Gareth remained frozen for a moment longer, then finally turned and retreated, motioning toward the bar in a daze. The moment wasn't over, but he had lost it, and he knew it. Conversations around the room picked up again, but they carried a brittle, uncertain edge, as though the performance of normalcy might somehow undo what had just been laid bare. But it couldn't. Alina stared down at her untouched water glass, her reflection warped slightly by the surface. She hadn't cried, not because she didn't want to, but because this moment didn't deserve her tears. It deserved witnesses and justice. Jordan leaned over slightly and whispered, "We need the reservation log." Alina didn't look up. "You know they'll say it was deleted." Jordan nodded. "That's why I had it forward me the backup. Every entry, every edit, time-stamped." We're not asking questions anymore. We're collecting proof. By the time Gareth made his way back toward them, his composure hanging by threads, Jordan already had the printed log in hand. It was folded neatly, like a weapon disguised in formality. Gareth approached cautiously, his steps unsteady. "Mr. Moore, I'm sure we can reach an understanding," he began, his voice now dipped in the tone of someone trying to rewrite the moment retroactively. Jordan didn't rise. He didn't need to. He simply unfolded the document and placed it on the table in front of them, tapping his finger on a timestamp. Table 3, Alina Moore, reserved at 3:01 p.m., edited at 2:48 p.m., to Langley Veronica. Alina didn't flinch. Gareth blinked at the page as though seeing a foreign language. I don't recall approving that change," he mumbled. "Of course you don't," Alina said quietly, her tone razor thin, because remembering would mean owning it. Jordan raised an eyebrow. "Amber doesn't have admin access. Only management can override VIP reservations. The room wasn't silent this time because it was afraid. It was silent because the illusion of order had been replaced with proof of manipulation. What had once been subtle was now documented." Gareth swallowed hard, glancing around as if hoping someone might intervene. No one did. His shoulders dropped slightly as the weight of consequence began to settle. "Perhaps I misunderstood the instruction," he tried, "or thought the reservation was tentative." Jordan didn't even blink. "The confirmation number was sent directly from your system to my assistant and forwarded to my wife." Then Alina leaned forward, her voice now stripped of every ounce of performance. "Do you know how exhausting it is to have to fight for spaces you already earned?" she asked. "To walk into rooms you helped build, only to be told you don't belong in them?" Her tone wasn't dramatic. It was clinical, precise. The kind of pain that doesn't scream, it etches. Gareth didn't respond. Couldn't. His silence was its own form of admission, echoing in every corner of the dining room. All around them, guests who had once felt comfortably detached now sat in the awkward intimacy of complicity. The reckoning wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It had arrived with receipts. From across the dining room, guests who had remained silent for the first half of the ordeal were now visibly reacting, not with outrage, but with unease. Phones emerged under linen napkins, faces glanced sideways, and whispers traveled faster than servers. Someone at a nearby table began to record, pretending to check emails while the camera lens pointed unmistakably toward table 3. But this wasn't about going viral. This was about impact. A woman at the bar leaned into her partner, whispering something that made him straighten his posture. No one was eating anymore. The ambiance of Vivre Blanc had fractured, split between polished luxury and raw truth. Alina sat motionless, her gaze fixed, her hands folded in front of her like she was guarding something sacred. Her space, her right. And when Jordan retrieved the reservation log, folded it back into his inner pocket and pulled out his phone again, no one dared to interrupt. A few seconds later, Rachel, the assistant general manager, arrived at their table, eyes wide behind stylish glasses. "Rachel," Jordan said, not unkindly, "please inform the board. Emergency session, 7:30 p.m., mandatory for all senior staff." She nodded, almost in a bow, and hurried off without a word. And just like that, the next chapter had begun. This one not for show, but for change. Jordan didn't look at Gareth again. He didn't need to. The man had become a symbol of what was no longer acceptable. As Gareth hovered near the host stand, pretending to check his headset or take calls, the cracks in his authority were visible to everyone. Alina, meanwhile, glanced around the room, not with defiance, but with clarity. She wasn't seeking validation. She was calculating the weight of what had just happened and realizing for the first time that she wasn't the only one. Across the room, a folded napkin arrived with the check at a corner table. The couple sitting there had watched everything. Alina noticed the woman nudge the napkin toward their server, who then discreetly carried it over and placed it at the corner of table 3. No explanation, just a gesture. She opened it slowly. 4 handwritten words in delicate script. "You weren't the first." Jordan read it over her shoulder. He didn't blink. "Then it's time," he said quietly, "to make sure you're the last." At precisely 7:30 p.m., while wine glasses clinked and foie gras was plated in the dining hall, a very different scene unfolded behind a frosted glass door marked "Staff Only." Inside Vivre Blanc's rarely used boardroom, once designed for strategic planning and luxury partnerships, silence reigned. The space was sleek, cold, and clinically elegant. A long obsidian table surrounded by high-backed leather chairs, a built-in wine bar untouched. But tonight, there would be no toasts. No indulgent whispers about quarterly growth, just judgment. Jordan sat at the head of the table with his hands calmly clasped, posture relaxed in the way only someone holding the fuse could afford. Alina wasn't present. This wasn't her battle anymore. She had already fought it in public. Now, it was his turn to finish it behind closed doors. The board members arrived one by one, some with cautious smiles, others with furrowed brows. No one spoke, and when Gareth Simmons walked in last, portfolio tucked under his arm like a useless shield, it was clear even he knew. This wasn't a conversation. It was a reckoning. Jordan broke the silence with a voice so even it felt rehearsed. This emergency meeting is convened under Clause 12, gross misconduct requiring executive review. The words hung like a gavel in the air. You've read the reports. But now, we're going to talk about what those reports don't say. One of the older board members, gray-haired, expensive watch, nervous fingers, leaned forward. Jordan, the situation was regrettable, yes. But is this level of escalation really warranted? Gareth has been with us since the beginning. He helped build the Vivre Blanc experience. Jordan turned his head slightly, not blinking. And what exactly is that experience? He asked. Is it about ambiance and foie gras? Or is it about curating comfort for the right kind of guest? Silence again. But this time it was different. No one was confused. They were scared. Because beneath the question was another one, louder and more dangerous. How much did you already know? And how long did you let it happen? A younger board member dressed in a sharp navy blazer and known for her obsession with data dashboards, cleared her throat. We reviewed the reservation log, she said. There's an override. But intent, how can we prove that? Jordan didn't flinch. He tapped a button on the touchpad embedded in the table. The lights dimmed slightly, and the projector screen descended from the ceiling with a mechanical whisper. Intent, he said, doesn't always need to be written in an email. Sometimes it's a pattern. The screen lit up with a color-coded spreadsheet, rows of names, timestamps, and edited entries. 17 instances in the last 6 months, he said. Minority guests being moved, delayed, or unfound in the system. In 12 of those cases, the tables were reassigned to last-minute arrivals, white guests, and in every single one of those 17 changes, Gareth had override access. The data didn't scream. It didn't accuse. It simply existed. Unavoidable, undeniable. It was the kind of truth that didn't beg to be believed. It just waited to be acknowledged. Gareth tried to speak, his voice suddenly dry. With all due respect, he said, you're drawing conclusions without context. There are plenty of reasons to reassign tables. High-profile guests, special requests, VIP protocol. Jordan cut in, not raising his voice, but shifting it enough to slice through the justifications, none of which justify a system that disproportionately erases one kind of guest. He looked at the board. Let's not pretend this doesn't impact the bottom line. Every one of those displaced guests spent less, left early, and in many cases, never returned. His gaze returned to Gareth. You're not just unethical, Gareth. You're inefficient. That one stung. Not because of the insult, but because of its precision. Gareth's face flushed red, not from shame, but from panic. You think you understand how this place operates? He snapped. You show up now and then, but you're not here day to day. You hide behind your title while we deal with the mess. His voice was rising, cracking. You don't know what it takes to maintain an elite brand like this. The room went still, and Jordan stood up slowly, now looking down at him, not with anger, but with control. Jordan's voice dropped low, not in volume, but in resonance, like a quiet storm building behind his chest. You're right, Gareth. I don't know how you maintain elitism by deleting a professor's name from the reservation list. I don't know how you measure class by complexion, but I do know leverage. From his jacket, he pulled out a thick, stapled document and laid it on the obsidian table with the deliberate weight of a final move in a chess game. As of 30 minutes ago, he said, I filed a motion with our legal team to initiate termination proceedings for breach of ethical conduct. The room seemed to inhale all at once, and Gareth stood abruptly, fists clenched, face twitching with disbelief. You're going to throw away over a decade of loyalty over one mistake? He demanded. Jordan didn't move. This isn't about loyalty. This is about a culture you cultivated, one that rewarded arrogance and punished difference. Then he extended the document, pages thick with signatures and policy. This is your official notice. Your access is revoked. HR will coordinate your exit. I suggest you speak to legal before reaching out to anyone on staff. Gareth's gaze darted from face to face around the table, looking for someone, anyone, to come to his defense, but no one met his eyes. As Gareth stormed out, the boardroom door clicking behind him like a sealed vault, Jordan didn't gloat. He didn't lean back and bask in vindication. He turned instead to the board members still seated, their expressions frozen somewhere between relief and awe. We rebuild from here, he said simply, with transparency, with accountability, with equity. One of the older men nodded slowly. Agreed. It's long overdue. Another, younger, chimed in. It's bold, but necessary. Jordan didn't smile. He wasn't here to win approval. He was here to draw a line. Then we start tonight, he said, and with that, he sat back down. Outside the boardroom, the restaurant hummed on, unaware that its core had just been gutted and redefined. Servers poured wine. Patrons whispered about menus and ambiance. But a shift was already pulsing beneath their feet. A silent transformation had begun, one that would travel far beyond the walls of Vivre Blanc. Because when power speaks softly but acts decisively, people don't just listen, they change. By the next morning, the story had already escaped the polished walls of Vivre Blanc. Headlines blazed across news feeds and social media like wildfire. Exclusive restaurant rocked by racial discrimination scandal. Major investor exposes internal bias at luxury dining hotspot. Someone from inside the boardroom had leaked parts of the meeting, audio perhaps, or summaries, but it didn't matter how. What mattered was that the truth was no longer confined to whispers and boardrooms. It had entered the public domain. Within hours, influencers who had once bragged about tagging the restaurant on their feeds issued public apologies. Some even deleted their old posts. Yelp reviews flooded in, not angry rants, but personal accounts, quiet humiliations, coded exclusions. My mother wore her best outfit and still got seated by the service doors. I thought it was just bad luck. Now I know better. But it wasn't the media firestorm that shook the city. It was Alina's statement. Posted at noon on her university blog, where she lectured in ethics, it was short, unembellished, and absolutely damning. When you have to fight to be seen in a space you helped finance, you begin to understand that exclusion wears many faces, some smiling, some silent. But silence is never neutral. In less than an hour, it had been shared over 10,000 times. Jordan read it from his office window overlooking the skyline, his phone buzzing nonstop, the city now on the edge of something far larger than a restaurant scandal. Lisa, his chief of staff, entered holding her iPad. We just got a call from the mayor's office, she said. They want to meet, probably trying to get ahead of the political damage. He nodded, not surprised. Schedule it for Friday. She paused, then added, also, 3 employees from other upscale restaurants have come forward. They're calling it the invisible velvet rope. They say what happened at Vivre isn't isolated. Jordan turned toward the window, watching the flow of pedestrians below. Then I want names, he said. If it's systemic, we map the system. And that's how it began. Not as a trend or a campaign, but as a reckoning. By 3 p.m., and a task force of entrepreneurs and equity advocates had launched an initiative to audit reservation systems and service behavior across the city's luxury venues. Vivre Blanc was just the first tile. Now, the whole pattern was being exposed. One misjudged table, one woman, one refusal to disappear. That's what it had taken to knock the first domino down. At 5:45 p.m., Jordan received a call from Richard Langley, patriarch of the Langley estate, investor, and Veronica's uncle. His voice was controlled, but there was an unmistakable undertone of urgency. You've made your point, Richard began. You've embarrassed good people, strong institutions. Let's be reasonable and talk about pulling this back before it becomes a crusade. Jordan didn't miss a beat. It is a crusade, he said, and hung up. That was the moment Langley and his circle realized they weren't dealing with a scandal. They were facing a shift. Inside Vivre Blanc, that shift was already taking shape. Servers were called in after hours for a private meeting. No suits, no white tablecloths, just bare tables and real talk. Jordan stood in the middle of the room, sleeves rolled, no script in hand. Some of you lived through this, some of you stayed quiet. I'm not here to punish fear. I'm here to end the culture that made silence feel safer than truth. A young black server named Isaiah raised his hand. I complained once about being skipped for promotion, he said, voice steady but uncertain. Got stuck on closing shifts for 3 straight months. Jordan didn't blink. You're promoted, effective immediately. Head of guest relations. The room exhaled all at once like a pressure valve finally released. The conversation that followed wasn't orderly or polite. It was raw. Servers, bussers, and kitchen staff shared their stories of microaggressions, retaliation, being overlooked for advancement or punished for speaking up. No one interrupted. No one rolled their eyes. People listened because for once they knew they'd be heard. By the end of the week, Jordan had enacted sweeping policy changes across all his business ventures. AI-supported reservation tracking to detect bias, anonymous reporting systems, quarterly ethics reviews conducted by third parties. The media called it radical. Some competitors called it reckless. But most guests, they called it right. Even more shocking than the press storm or political inquiries was the call Jordan received days later from Veronica Langley herself. No apology, no accountability, just a polished attempt at negotiation. My family's prepared to donate, support your reforms, even divest if it'll help ease the attention. Jordan didn't shout. He didn't argue. Your name isn't being dragged, he said, voice even. It's being revealed. She didn't reply, just ended the call. But it didn't matter. The damage was already done, and the healing had already begun. The ripple effect of Vivre Blanc's reckoning was fast and far-reaching. In Seattle, a luxury spa quietly revised its intake forms after a client referenced a viral clip of Alina's quote. In Atlanta, a jazz lounge changed its dress code policies after facing backlash for disproportionately turning away patrons with natural hairstyles. In New York, an upscale hotel introduced bias detection software into its booking system. No press release, just action. This wasn't just a flash of outrage. It was a movement. And at the center of it wasn't a politician or an activist. It was Alina Moore, a professor who hadn't set out to lead a cause, but simply refused to vanish. When her university invited her to speak at an ethics conference, she didn't take the stage. She submitted a paper instead. Table 3, a case study on silent power and the geography of disrespect. It was accepted within hours and circulated far beyond academia. Jordan knew then, this wasn't just about a dinner. This was a blueprint. The world wasn't just watching, it was learning. A week later, Vivre Blanc felt different. Not in the decor or the branding, but in the atmosphere. The wisteria outside had begun to bloom again, but now it framed not exclusivity, but transformation. The restaurant's infamous reservation desk was now digital and fully transparent. Every booking logged, encrypted and auditable. The hostess, once instructed to prioritize certain aesthetics, now wore her natural curls freely. Her name was Maya, and embroidered on her blazer were 5 simple words. Equity is the new luxury. The layout had shifted too, not by knocking down walls, but by removing barriers. No more hidden tables near the service doors. Lighting had been adjusted to feel inclusive, not intimidating. Even the menu had been rewritten, each section honoring cultural cuisines once overlooked. And perhaps most importantly, the new patrons were different. They weren't just the elite who had once ruled the space. They were the ones who had long avoided it, now stepping in, not as exceptions, but as rightful guests. The standard had changed, not just in policy, but in presence. Behind the scenes, the transformation wasn't performative. It was structural. Hiring practices had been overhauled. Blind screenings were implemented. Community outreach programs initiated. Isaiah, now officially Director of Guest Experience, began holding weekly team forums where suggestions, grievances, and ideas were welcomed openly. And at the top of it all, Jordan Moore no longer stayed in the shadows. He made himself visible, not as a figurehead, but as a standard bearer. He wasn't micromanaging, but he was present. His leadership became a model across the hospitality industry, admired by some, challenged by others, but impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, Alina returned to campus with a new quiet gravity. Students no longer viewed her from a respectful distance. They stopped her in hallways, told her, "I read your post," or, "Thank you for saying what I never could." She always responded humbly, deflecting praise, because she never meant to become a symbol. She had simply refused to be erased. Her guest lecture, once titled Ethics in Emerging Systems, had been renamed by the university. The Geography of Power. Whose table is it anyway? Attendance tripled. She didn't bring up her story during the lecture. Not until the end. And even then, it wasn't about herself. This wasn't just about a table, she said. It was about how systems displace people who don't conform to an unspoken aesthetic. But aesthetics are not facts. They're choices. And we can choose better. Outside the walls of Vivre Blanc, those choices were being made. Quietly, steadily. Restaurants revisited reservation policies. Corporate offices re-examined internal culture. Even fashion brands began to rethink campaigns once blind to nuance. This wasn't just awareness. It was change. Change that began with one woman's name being removed from a list. One refusal to stand quietly near the kitchen. One moment that echoed far beyond the white linen of an elite dining room. It didn't start in courtrooms or with hashtags. It started over dinner. And it wasn't done yet. Because systems don't change on their own. People do. Late one evening, long after the last guests had left and the dining room sat in dim silence, Jordan stood beside table 3. The space around him felt different now. No longer a fortress of exclusion, but a place where something had been rewritten. He ran his hand along the edge of the table, where a small brass plaque had been affixed discreetly. Dr. Alina Moore's table. Legacy and presence. It wasn't about ownership. It was about memory. Alina joined him moments later, her heels soft against the wooden floor. She stood beside him without speaking, both of them gazing at the room that had once tried to diminish her. "I thought I'd hate coming back here," she murmured, arms loosely crossed. "But instead, it feels like I finally own the silence." Jordan turned to her, voice low. "Not own," he said. "You rewrote it." They stepped onto the terrace where the city moved below them in its usual rhythm. Cars, conversations, lights blinking behind windows. "Do you think it'll last?" she asked. Jordan took a moment. "Some will resist. Some will pretend. But enough will remember." And that's how it begins to shift. Inside, the staff finished their closing tasks. One of the newest hires, a Vietnamese woman named Lynn, who had once been too intimidated to apply to a place like Vivre Blanc, left a note on the bar counter before clocking out. "Thank you for building a room that finally fits me." Alina spotted the note through the glass and didn't say a word, but the corner of her mouth twitched ever so slightly. Jordan pulled out a folder then, filled with proposals, expansion requests, offers from 3 other cities asking how to replicate the Vivre transformation. "It's starting," he said. Alina looked at the folder, then toward the city skyline. "Then give them the blueprint," she replied. "But make sure they understand. The standard isn't the table. It's the courage to stand beside it, even when you're told you don't belong." And with that, they turned back toward the restaurant, where no one stood by the kitchen anymore. Where silence didn't equal compliance. Where presence now carried weight. The room hadn't just been reclaimed, it had been redefined. Because sometimes the revolution doesn't march. Sometimes it dines. And the echo of that evening, the one that began with an empty seat, would ripple for years.